everyone. In this talk, we're going to discuss internal and external training loads in sport, primarily. We're going to look at similarities and differences between the two and common technologies used to assess each. And at the end of this, you should be able to understand the difference between internal and external training load quantification, or how they're assessed or measured. You should be able to identify at least a couple internal and external training load metrics. And you should be able to identify pros and cons of using internal and external load measures for pragmatic application with your prospective clients, whether it's in a physical therapy clinic, with a sports team, with children, or with some other clientele in a strength and conditioning or performance context. Now, what is training load? Training load is a measure or a combination of multiple measures that aim to capture the stress on the body imposed by training or games. And it can be a bunch of different things. It depends on how you want to quantify it. It could be one or a bunch of different items that could range from heart rate response to how fast you're running and for how long you're running for, to the weight that you're lifting, to a variety of other items that impose stress on the body. So why is training load monitoring important? The first reason is that it can provide a scientific explanation for changes in performance or health. It gives or provides clarity and confidence for what's going on, which minimizes the degree of uncertainty that occurs with changes. It also allows for retrospective examination of load performance relationships, which enables for appropriate planning for training load and competitions to maximize performance outcomes. You may be able to reduce the potential for injury at some point, illness, or certainly you could reduce the potential for non-functional overreaching or overtraining if you're monitoring and prescribing training loads appropriately. It's important to monitor them so that you can understand when, in what situations those things are occurring, and try to prevent against them, or to address those training load fluctuations to remedy a situation that is occurring, such as if someone is overtrained, knowing when that's happening and what to do about it. It may also be useful for team selection in determining which athletes are prepared for the demands of competition. Now we're going to talk about external versus internal training loads. I like to think of external as load that happens on the outside, and internal as what happens on the inside. An example of this is we see this guy pushing a sled here. Maybe he pushes 100 pounds on the sled for 30 meters. That would be considered an external training load metric. And maybe his heart rate average for that 100 pounds over 30 meters was 165 beats per minute. That would be an internal training load metric. So, my apologies. For external training load, the work completed by the individual measured independently of his or her internal characteristics is kind of what we're looking at. And for internal load, these are more indicators reflecting the actual psychophysiological response that the body initiates to cope with the requirements elicited by the external load that was performed. For example, this guy pushes 100 pounds over 30 meters. And how is the body responding? Well, in this case, the body is responding by elevating the heart rate to 165 beats per minute for that duration. And now, if we want to take this one step further, we can segregate internal and external training load metrics into subjective and objective measures. A couple of internal load subjective measures, as you see in the top left box there, could be rating a perceived exertion, or asking someone essentially how hard the session was on a scale that could be 0 to 10, or 1 to 10, or 1 to 21 is the Borg scale. I think Foster's runs from 1 to 10. Or you could ask somebody, for example, after a set of back squats, how many repetitions did you have left in the tank? What were the repetitions in reserve? and a subjective external load measure, which is not a very common indice. You might ask someone how far they thought that they ran if you don't have a way to actually measure that distance. And if you track that over time, as long as the person is consistent in their thought processes, you may have a decent measure of external subjective training load. Or the perceived amount of time that someone was doing something for could be another external load metric that is subjective in nature. That's on the top right corner. When we move to the bottom left, we get into objective metrics for internal load. Those could be heart rate response, blood lactate, serum creatine kinase, which is a marker of muscle damage. And on the external load side of things, an objective measure could be the distance ran via GPS unit, or the amount of time you spend in running at high speeds. It could be a power output metric. How much force are you producing? How long are you producing it for? Or it could be a volume type of metric. For example, you lifted on the basketball 150 pounds for 5 reps for 5 sets. You multiply all those things together and you have some sort of volume metric there that's objective in nature. And again, it's important to note, remember, external load, things on the outside, and internal load is essentially those responses to the things that are happening on the outside, that are occurring within or inside the body. And as you might expect, there are tons of technologies out there used to collect this information. The complexity ranges from something super simple and cheap to implement, such as the rating of perceived exertion scale, which is what you see in that white box with figure 1 underneath it in the middle. And this is essentially asking someone how hard an exercise session was. And it ranges to something very complex and difficult to implement, like perhaps a 3D motion capture system, where you might need cameras placed around a constrained area within your environment to capture the information. And there are a bunch of things in between, such as linear position transducers, which measure how fast something is moving. There are also accelerometers and GPS units, which are similar in that they can measure how fast you're moving and where you're moving and number of accelerations, deaccelerations, things like that. There are heart rate monitors and wristwatches and various other things. And wristwatches typically hang their hat on heart rate, accelerometry, or both to collect information. But we'll talk about the pros and cons of using a wristwatch versus some of these other more fancy and expensive pieces of tech, like a heart rate belt, chest strap, and GPS or accelerometry devices that are not worn on the wrist a little bit later in the course. Now, I think this is a great chart or graphic that represents the interactions between external and internal load. And this is not my graphic. Well, what you see is my modification of a graphic, but it's based on a graphic that was shown in a paper called Internal and External Training Load, 15 years on. I think that the primary author, the first author on that paper was Franco Impellizzeri. The group did an amazing job at portraying the interaction between external and internal load in their graph, and I pretty much stole it from them. And I would, instead of listening to me, like I would just stop right now probably and just go read that paper to better understand these concepts, because I'll probably butcher the heck out of it. So, but let's start from the beginning. We see a big black box that says training goals. And these training goals are something that should be based on our needs analysis. At least in this class, we talked a lot about needs analysis because, in my opinion, it's the most important component of exercise prescription. And what we're essentially doing in a needs analysis is we're identifying through measurement where a person is at, like what their strengths and weaknesses are. For example, are you strong? Are you fast? Are you powerful? Do you have a substantial asymmetry or flexibility limitation, etc.? And we're understanding what their exercise related goal or activity entails, or what the demands of that activity are. For example, in basketball, you might be jumping off a single leg a lot. There's a lot of jumping and landing. There's sprinting. When you're boxing someone out, that would probably require some resistive lower body strength. And what you're doing is you're taking where the person is at, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and you're looking at the demands of the activity that they want to excel in, and you're figuring out a way to bring them as close as possible to what they need to do to excel in their exercise-related activity as efficiently as possible. And the way that we do that is that if we move down to the exercise prescription piece, is we prescribe exercises that have certain volumes and intensities and densities. And when I say density, I'm talking about rest periods essentially. For example, performing 5 sets of back squats or 5 sets of 5 back squats with 5 minutes rest has a lower density than performing 5 sets of 5 back squats with 30 seconds rest. Because in the latter example, you're performing the same amount of work in less time. So essentially, those gray boxes that say organization, quality, and quantity are ways to determine what we're prescribing from an external load standpoint. So those things that we're doing in our exercise prescription, the sets, the reps, the sprint distances, the accelerations, deaccelerations, all that stuff are all components of external load. Now, as practitioners, if we look at external load, we have a good idea of what the athlete or exerciser has accomplished, which is really valuable. For example, if we look at the total distance covered for a runner from 1 week to the next, we will know whether or not he or she is covering more or less distance, at least relative to the week prior. And we'll also be able to compare that number to perhaps the distance that is required of that runner to run in their race. So for example, let's say that the runner runs 5,000 meters in week 1, and again, 5,000 meters in week 2. Now we know the distance that the runner covered, but the distance that runner covered is not the thing that is eliciting the training adaptations. It's the internal response to that 5,000 meters that tells the body how to adapt to that stimulus. 2 athletes could respond to those 5,000 meter runs in totally different ways, depending on the factors that you see in the red to the right. And similarly, the same athlete, again, depending on those factors to the right and others, could respond to that same 5,000 meters distance that he or she ran in different ways. So the response to the external load is what will ultimately determine the functional adaptations of the training that you prescribe. And let's look at this in a different way, maybe in a weight room context. Let's say you were to prescribe a set of 5 reps of back squats for 2 weeks with the same weight each time. In week 1, you see that the athlete completes all 5 repetitions smoothly and fast. They look great. But in week 2, again, using the same loads, same reps, same sets, the athlete can barely complete the 4th and 5th repetitions. Now, when we're thinking about training adaptations, do you think that the athlete is going to adapt the same way that they did to the first session where they performed those reps smoothly and fast as they would to the second session where the 4th and 5th reps they could barely irk out? Probably not. And given that your goal or your entire goal is to elicit adaptations or training adaptations, I guess in this context, that correspond with your training goals, internal load is something that becomes extremely valuable. And again, I want to tie this back into the factors listed on the right-hand side. There are various things that can affect the internal response to an external load exposure. Given the same external load, the same athlete could have a very different response, which can partially be governed by any combination of the factors on the right and others. For example, imagine you went for a run last week and got your best time ever. Today, you have the exact same run planned, status quo, but for whatever reason, you couldn't sleep last night. The time it takes you to complete the run the coordination of your muscle movements and the overall physiological and physical output could be entirely different because of how those factors on the right affected your response to the same run. Similarly, if you were to run a mile in the heat, let's say versus a mile when it's 65 degrees and sunny, although you ran a mile both times, and that's what it looks like on paper, you ran a mile, your body would respond to those two scenarios in different ways, which would ultimately govern your functional adaptations to that exercise. Anyways, I'm going to show the chart that Franco and his colleagues did now, and you can see how similar it is to mine. I literally kind of just stole it from them. Well, now I guess I'm asking for permission, Franco and Aaron Coots, and you guys. Can I use your graphic in this presentation? It might be a little bit too late, but I hope they say yes. A lot of people like to focus on external load, and when in reality, I guess the summary is a lot of people like to focus on external load when in reality, it's your internal response to the external load that governs the training adaptation. And so I propose that instead of collecting external load exclusively, it would make sense to integrate internal load measures within the external load data collection. And if I were to pick one, I would pick internal load because I think it provides more value, but we can get into that later. And now let's go through a couple of examples illustrating these concepts to a certain extent. Here we have three athletes, Frank, Jenna, and Julian. They all participated in the same conditioning session. They all covered pretty much the same amount of distance in meters from a GPS unit or accelerometer. And they all did it in more or less the same amount of time, or exactly the same amount of time. They all did it in 10 minutes. Say it was a conditioning test. But now, when we add on a layer of heart rate or average heart rate response, you see that each athlete had a very different response to that session. And if we were to take away that internal load metric, let's say, and we were just to look at the external loads or the time to completion and the distance covered in meters, looks like everyone kind of did the same thing more or less. And they did, but their response to it was very different. And what we're going to add on next is another layer, rating of perceived exertion, or RPE. So we have three athletes, Frank, Jenna, and Julian. They all covered more or less the same amount of distance in the same amount of time. Frank's average heart rate was way lower than Jenna's, which was lower than Julian's. But Frank's RPE was similar to Julian's RPE, despite having a drastically lower average heart rate response. And Jenna's kind of in the middle of the two, and her RPE wasn't that hard or relative to what it could be maximally. And I want you to pause the video and take a second and think about what might be going on here, comparing one athlete's responses to their own. For example, why would Frank's heart rate be so low and his rating of perceived exertion be so high? And also compare athletes to one another. What might explain why Frank's RPE and Julian's RPE are high and Jenna's is not? So take a second. All right, so now when you're back, we can go through this a little bit. Like we saw in Franco's graph from international training load 15 years on, there are a lot of different factors that can affect the response to the external load or the distance covered and the time to completion. And typically, at least in group sessions, the relative external load exposure is similar between athletes or positions, unless an athlete is recovering from an injury or something like that. This is probably true in programming also. If you have a group of athletes or clients, you generally aren't prescribing one client 80% of their 1 rep max and another one with 20% of their 1 rep max during the same session, unless, of course, one is recovering, similar concept, unless one is recovering from an injury and another is not. With team practices, depending on the sport, generally most athletes of the same position are doing the same things as one another. For example, all of the running backs are pretty much running the same amount of distance. Let's just say that they're all starting running backs. Same thing with, let's say, basketball guards, starting guards. They're generally running the same amount of distance. However, those 3 or 4 guards that are all starting and running the same amount of distance could have drastically different adaptations to that stimulus compared with one another, at least internally. So this goes to show that there are tons of factors that can affect how someone responds to training, including their effort, nutrition, psychological well-being, genetics, and their pre-existing strengths and weaknesses. And now, when you're comparing, let's say, Frank, his RPE response relative to his heart rate response and the distance covered, one insight that you might make is, well, Frank was trying really hard, and he's just really, really darn fit. So that's why his heart rate response was lower. Whereas Julian, maybe he's not as fit as Frank, so they run the same distance, same amount of time. They're both trying really hard, and Julian has a much higher heart rate response. Or Frank might perceive his exertion very differently than Julian does. And now we're getting into subjective versus objective metrics, where Frank's 8 out of 10 could be very different from Julian's 8 out of 10. And that could explain the difference there also. And similarly with Jenna, maybe she said that on this conditioning test, I guess, she gave a 5 out of 10 RPE. Maybe she never really gives a 10 or a 9 or an 8. She thinks everything in her head, she's like, everything is kind of easy unless she's literally dying. So maybe 5 is one of the highest RPEs that she's ever had. And her highest that she's ever given is a 7. So it's important to understand whether the metric is internal or external, and whether it's subjective or objective when trying to make insights from the information that you're getting. Oh, I think I just... Now, we're looking at training over time. We got Frank, Jenna, and Julian, same athletes. Now we have an exercise that's being prescribed in the weight room, a back squat for each athlete. And beneath that, there's an RPE associated with each of those, I guess, sets. So let's go through Frank. Week 1, back squats, 150 pounds, X5 for 5 reps. That's 80% of his 1 rep max. And you'll notice across the board, the percent 1 rep max is the same for each week for each athlete. So they're comparable in that sense. Everyone's lifting different loads because some might be stronger than others. So Frank, 150 pounds for 5 reps at 80% of his 1 rep max, week 1. We progress him to 165 pounds for 5 reps, which is 85% of his 1 rep max for week 2. And for week 3, he bumps up to 90% of his 1 rep max, which is 170 pounds for 5 reps. Week 4, he's doing 95% of his 1 rep max. That's what's being prescribed. And we're trying to understand, is that the right prescription for these people based on what they had done previously and how they responded to that based on their RPEs. Now, one thing to note is I just made up these numbers. So I don't know if 250, I don't know what 85% 1RM for 165 pounds is, and I don't know if the progressions are actually right. I just threw in numbers. But we see in this situation, everyone's performing the same relative external load. They're performing 80% 1RM, 85% 1RM, 90% 1RM. Then they're going to perform 95% 1RM in week 4. So similarly, in this situation, internal load or RPE may be a better indicator of how that person is responding to training over time, which should give you insights into how he or she is responding to that program you're giving overall, rather than looking exclusively at the external load numbers or the percent 1RMs. And remember, external load could be volume, intensity, repetitions, sets, or a bunch of other things. In this case, we have all of our athletes progressing via increases in percent 1RM on their back squats while keeping the repetitions the same. Now, what would you expect, or would you expect the same adaptations from each of these athletes? Why or why not? Now, let's take a second and just think about it. You can pause the video if you want, and in a couple of seconds here, I'm going to start talking again. So, by just looking at the external loads, would you be able to effectively program week 4 for each of these athletes? I'd say probably not, because you have no idea how they're responding to those increases in load. I mean, you know whether or not they completed it or not. You see what's on the paper. For example, Frank, week 3, 175 x5, he did it, or 170 x5, he did it, 90% of his 1RM. Jenna, 275 for 5 reps, 90% of 1RM, she did it. But you don't have an idea of how they responded to it or how hard it was for them to do. So if we look at this data, Julian may be pushing a little bit too hard. I don't know. He might hurt himself if he goes 95% 1RM in week 4. That's because probably his RPE in week 1 was a little bit too high. It was too hard to begin with. Then we bumped him up more. Then it got really hard. And then in week 3, he was pretty much maxing out with 90% of his 1RM there. And if we continue this path, he's either not going to be able to complete all the reps or he's going to get hurt. And now Jenna, on the other hand, she might not be adapting optimally either. It looks like 225 x5 was too light. She goes from a 4 out of 10 RPE to a 5 out of 10 to a 5 out of 10. And now we're prescribing 95% of her 1RM, which is really heavy. What is it going to be, a 6 out of 10? And again, another thing to think about is, what is Jenna's max RPE that she gives? Maybe it is right, maybe it's not, but you need to do a little bit more of an investigation there. Whereas Frank, it looks like, it's progressing the way that we thought. He goes from a 4 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10. And, maybe we're planning, we want this week 4 95% 1RM to be a 10 out of 10. And now we're going to go through common methods and technologies for assessing internal training load, and then we'll go over external as well. Heart rates are a good internal load measure that are generally feasible to apply in most settings. Similarly, there are some individual heart rate solutions that generally work with wrist straps, such as Whoop or Apple Watch or Fitbits. And then you have a bunch of other internal load metrics that are not objective, but are free and really easy to implement particularly in large group settings. Repetitions in reserve, or how many reps you have left in the tank, free. Rating of perceived exertion, how hard was it on some scale, free. Face strain, which is just your subjective gauge or their subjective gauge of how strained their face was during a set. Again, free. I'm not saying that's a good metric or a bad metric. It's just throwing out ideas there of things that could be feasible and free. And post-exercise perceived muscle soreness or fatigue. Again, when I say post-exercise, I mean immediately post-exercise or immediately post-set, because monitoring the training load response is something different than monitoring the training load itself. And assessing muscle fatigue on the morning after a session may be a training load response measure, but not necessarily a measure of training load itself. And then we get into some other items like blood lactate or creatine kinase post-exercise. Those aren't really feasible. I mean, sometimes they are, but in most instances, you're not going to be doing that stuff, although you could. And then you got to figure out what value it's providing you relative to the other things that you could be doing. You could also be looking at VO2. I think someone told me, I don't even know how to pronounce the company name, I think they're $6,000 for a portable VO2 device. But in any case, assessing VO2 directly is not necessarily feasible in most settings. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. And now some common methods and technologies for external load. You got accelerometers or gyroscopes and GPS units. That's pretty feasible in most team sports settings, but you need to have the staff available to make that work. If you're one staff member looking after 20 to 30 athletes, I would argue that that's probably not the most feasible solution. And a more feasible solution in that instance would probably be individualized accelerometry or GPS via wristwatches and things like that an athlete can set up themselves. Whereas a team solution, such as the companies listed on the first row, that can be a really difficult thing to pull off on your own with a bunch of athletes. Then there are camera systems that you could use. Again, I mean, those are really expensive and they're really difficult to pull off depending on your resources. A couple very easy ones are just duration, either whether it's perceived by the athlete themselves, perceived by the coach, or your actual monitoring of the duration of an event. That's very feasible. Monitoring sets, reps, and load, that can be feasible or it cannot be feasible depending on how you're doing it. For example, if you're monitoring your athletes and tracking every set, rep, and load that they're doing, that could be really difficult unless you're working one-on-one with someone. Whereas if there's buy-in from the athletes and they're marking those things down themselves and they're honest about it, you could use that information as an external load metric. Then there are linear position transducers, which we talked about a little bit at the beginning of the lecture, which measure the velocity of things, and that can be used to track external load. Then there are also force plates, which again force plates are great. More and more force plates are becoming more user friendly for the athletes to actually monitor themselves. And the reason why I say that they're not feasible in the context of monitoring external load is because I see force plates as being used more as an external load or training load monitoring of response, as opposed to actually an indicator of the load that the athlete is undergoing. Although you could use force plates in that context, it's just a little bit more cumbersome and difficult to do because the athlete would have to perform many, if not all, of their sets on force plates of exercise. And you're generally, unless your whole ground is made of force plates, or your whole practice field is made of force plates, it's not necessarily something that can be used in the sport-specific context during practice or during a game. And now here are a bunch of pros and cons of external load monitoring. And we're focusing on GPS and accelerometers because they're the most frequently used right now. I dislike reading off slides, but I'm just going to do it on this one. So some pros of external load monitoring with GPS or accelerometers is that they show what was physically accomplished in a given session or during a given event. They can be used to understand whether a program is eliciting expected physical outputs. For example, is the athlete reaching higher acceleration magnitudes? As you continue to work on acceleration with them in the weight room, you can figure that out by putting an accelerometer or GPS unit on their back while they're practicing or performing some sort of standardized test. Another example is the athlete attaining higher peak speeds. For example, if you're working on maximal speed development with them in the weight room during practice or, again, standardized event, are they reaching higher peak speeds? You can also, for example, is an exerciser getting the expected number of steps per day? If someone's wearing let's say a client that you want to improve the amount of physical activity they're doing, you're able to track the number of steps that they're taking and figure out whether or not they're accomplishing their external load, related goals. Another pro is that some metrics are very easy for athletes and coaches to understand, like high intensity distance, the pounds someone's lifting, jump height, number of steps. And another pro is that most devices are non-invasive and they're portable. Wristwatches, GPS units in the gear of padded sports like ice hockey or football, where the player may not even notice that the device is there. And they're minimally invasive in some other sports like basketball, where you're not wearing gear per se or padded gear, but the location of it is generally on the upper back, and it's not really cumbersome for the athlete to wear within their shirt, a specific shirt that's made for that purpose. A couple of cons are that most technologies are expensive. Many GPS units lack accuracy. And now we're going to go over pros and cons of external load monitoring, specifically relating to GPS and accelerometers, because they're most frequently used in sport right now and probably everywhere. So I usually don't like reading off slides, but I'm going to do it here. So some of the pros for GPS and accelerometers for external load monitoring are that they show what was physically accomplished in a given session. They can be used to understand whether a training program is eliciting expected outputs. For example, is the athlete reaching higher acceleration magnitudes as you continue to work with them in the weight room or whatnot on acceleration? And you can figure that out by having a GPS unit or an accelerometer on them when they're performing a standardized sport-specific task or during practice. Are their acceleration magnitudes higher? Another example is the athlete attaining higher peak speeds if you're working on maximal speed development with the athlete. Again, you can figure that out through some sort of standardized sport-specific protocol, or again, during practices or games, are their peak speeds increasing? Similarly, but this time for just a general exerciser, if you prescribe more exercise, are they getting the expected number of steps per day? Are they increasing the number of steps that they're taking? You can figure that out with an accelerometry unit or GPS unit. Typically, with those types of exercisers, it'll be worn on the wrist. Many watches out there, like the ones we discussed. Another pro is that some metrics are very easy for athletes and coaches to understand. For example, distance covered, pounds lifted, jump height, number of steps. Those things are very easy for people to comprehend and wrap their head around, which can go a long ways when communicating information with a coach or practitioner or even an individual athlete or exerciser. Another pro is that most devices are non-invasive and portable. GPS units in gear of padded sports, for example, or wristwatches, they're both non-invasive and they're portable. For example, in ice hockey or football, GPS units, they'll go inside the padding, and players may not even notice that the units are on there. Whereas, I mean, it's a little bit more invasive, but still minimally invasive when you wear them in non-padded sports such as basketball. There's a special shirt generally that's made that they'll wear with the GPS unit or accelerometer inside it, and they can feel it on their upper back a little bit. That's where it's generally placed, but it's still it's not, it doesn't really get in the way. Now, a few cons. Most of these technologies are pretty expensive. This is a strong statement. Many GPS units lack accuracy. That's not necessarily true. There there's a lot of variability in the accuracy between GPS units and accelerometry units. And as we progress through time, the accuracy continues to get better and better and better. I know that initially the accuracy was not great. But again, one of the limitations is that as accuracy increases over time, the comparability of the data sets needs to be taken into consideration also. If you're looking at longitudinal data and all of a sudden a new GPS unit or a GPS unit you're using gets more accurate in the new model of the unit, you need to consider how you're going to marry those two data sets together if you're assessing GPS metrics over time. Another limitation is that GPS only works outdoors. I mean, there are local positioning systems, but these require installations within an enclosed facility, which I know, like for example, in ice hockey, if you play in a certain arena and then you train in a different arena, that can make things a little bit difficult because you need to have two installments of these local positioning systems within two different arenas, as opposed to, I mean, it's a lot easier just to go outside and have the GPS work all the time, no matter where you are. And then another thing with hockey specifically, I guess, or any indoor sport, is if you're on the road or you're at a different arena that you're not normally at home, then either the scope of the data you're going to be able to collect will be limited, or you're going to have to do installs at those foreign arenas also to get the full amount of information that you would be getting at your home arenas. Another con is that they require a lot of manpower to handle. You got to set it up on the gear or the shirts every day. You got to take them off frequently and charge them, and then you got to put them back on the gear. So for example, a day in the life, right? You could set up the GPS units in the morning, athletes practice, you take them off, all the gear, which could be, I don't know, I mean, if you have a football team, it could be 50 athletes, 60 athletes, and then you charge them all. Sometimes you have to download the information to the PC or the computer locally, and then what you'll end up doing is either replacing those units on the gear that night so they're ready to go the next day, or wake up the next morning super early and come in and put the units on everyone's gear. And another con is that the placement of the unit affects the metrics. And there can be, depending on how you have the unit set up, a lot of variability in the placement of the unit. The way that it's oriented, the way that it's facing, how much it moves around, whether it's in the shirt or in the pads, those are all things to consider and affect the accuracy of the metrics that you're looking at. So those are all those are all pros and cons, and I'm sure that there are a bunch more that I haven't thought of for our GPS and accelerometry units for external load monitoring. And now here are some pros and cons of internal load monitoring. And the most common objective internal load metric or monitoring system, I would say, is heart rate driven. So this is kind of specific to heart rate. Some of the pros are that, one, heart rate, it illustrates the physiological response to the imposed training, which is ultimately what will determine the training adaptations. That's what we've been talking about this whole time, internal load versus external load. Generally, they're not as expensive as external load monitoring, or particularly GPS units. And heart rate, depending on the system that you have or the way that you go about it, doesn't require as much manpower with most systems. For example, I know one heart rate team solution company where the heart rate belts have batteries that last months on end with frequent use, and there's no charging of the heart rate belts. There's no data download. It just goes directly to the system through a cloud. So a pragmatic example is that, if you're in ice hockey or football, theoretically, you could hang up all the heart rate belts in all the players' stalls, and if they put them on and replace them and put them back in their stall, you don't have to go take the heart rate belts out and exchange batteries every day or bring them to your computer and download the information. You can just set them up, assign them to the players, and that players can wear them, put them back, wear them, put them back for months, and you won't have any issues, and you'll have a streamlined data collection process. Another pro is that most technologies are very accurate. In general, wrist-worn heart rate recording is less accurate than chest-worn, but there are many wrist-worn devices that are extremely accurate. And again, there's a lot of variability within these devices, so it's important to look into the validity and reliability of the device that you're looking to purchase, because some are more accurate and more reliable than others. Another pro is that even if it's not placed directly on the chest or the wrist, the results aren't likely to differ by much, which is very unlike GPS or accelerometry units, where if the positioning is off or if the positioning is altered, there may be a drastic difference in the metrics that you're looking at. Whereas heart rate, there may be a little bit more error if it's misplaced a little bit, but it's not going to really affect the metrics that you're looking at to a significant degree, unless it's really off, unless it's falling off the chest, for example. A couple of cons: similar to GPS, they can be expensive, and when they're worn on the chest, they can be uncomfortable and semi-invasive. And depending on the material that the heart rate belt is used with, and in padded sports, depending on the gear that goes on top of the belt, it may not be a great idea to put heart rate belts on people from a safety standpoint and from an invasiveness standpoint. Cons, again, there's no measure of physical output, just the internal work. Some heart rate companies, and well, I guess this isn't specific to internal or external, but nowadays, units are being created that go around the chest that record heart rate, and they do allow for collection of some accelerometry metrics as well. This is kind of up and coming. There are a couple companies doing this now. It's a good way to kill a couple of birds with one stone, if that's something that interests you. There's also a higher risk for non-compliance with heart rate monitoring, at least in my experiences, because the person has actually put the monitor around their chest or wrist and has to remember to do it every time. Whereas oftentimes GPS units can be set up within the gear, integrated within the shirt by the staff, without the player having to think about it or the athlete having to think about it. Whereas heart rate, it's kind of every single time you put on, or you're going to put on your gear, you got to remember to put on your heart rate belt first. But in some instances, like I know some wrist wearable companies create heart rate units around the wrist that really you don't have to worry about, because they're kind of 24/7 like devices. So as long as you put it on once and you remember to charge the device on a semi-frequent basis, you'll be okay. And next, I have 12 common training load monitoring mistakes. That's part of this lecture, but I'm going to save it for the next one because this has already gone really long. Thanks for watching the internal and external training loads lecture. And at the end of this one, or at the end of the next one, the 12 common training load monitoring mistakes, I'll have some takeaways from the both of them. And I'll catch you in the next one.